Hello and welcome to my channel, Diluc Gaming. With Genshin Impact version Luna 1, we're getting a 5-star standard banner character selector ticket, as well as a constellation selector for a bunch of characters. And in this video, I'm going to go over my personal recommendations for which characters you should consider selecting. Now, the first thing we need to familiarize ourselves with really quick is just what are these two selectors. For one, it looks like we are going to get the 5-star standard banner selector ticket where we can pick any of the 8 standard banner characters. Then in terms of the other 5-star constellation thing, this is going to take a little bit of time to get, I believe about 8 weeks. So not something immediately applicable, but you can work towards this by doing the weekly missions. And yeah, basically we're going to see exactly how this works, but it looks like you're going to have to do a bunch of daily missions or something like that. And if you do that for about 8 weeks, then you'll be able to get all of these rewards along with the free constellations for these characters. Now, a few rules that we're going to get full confirmation once, we can actually redeem the characters, but it looks like you can only select a constellation for these characters. So that means if you don't own the characters, you should not be able to just get them, get the first copy of the character in order to obtain the character, but instead only a constellation for the character. The next rule, I believe, which they mentioned in the live stream, is that you can only get 1 constellation per character. So despite this being a recurring event every 12 weeks, I believe, over the course of the year, you can get 4 constellations. However, because you can only get 1 constellation for one of these characters, for each of these characters, you cannot get, for example, constellation 4 Eula or something. Instead, you can only get constellation 1 Eula, constellation 1 Hu Tao, constellation 1 Xiao, constellation 1 Ganyu, etc., etc. So before continuing, we do need to quickly understand another new feature that is coming in version Luna 1, and that is the Masterless Stella Fortuna, whatever. And this thing basically you obtain when you get a constellation specifically for 5-star characters on a character that's already at constellation 6, and that means that for most players, they'll be getting these, if they get them at all, from standard banner characters that they have at constellation 6. For example, if you're like me and you have constellation, 1 million Qiqi, then if you get another constellation on her, you'll get one of these Masterless Stellar Fortunas. Retroactively, any constellations you got past constellation 6, you should be getting a Masterless Stellar Fortuna. And what you can do with these is that you can spend 1 to bring a character from level 90 to level 95, or you can spend 2 to bring a character from level 95 to level 100. So in order to get from level 90 to 100, you'll need to spend 3 total. Now, for example, for an attack scaling character like Skirk, she gains damage from the base attack increase as well as from the defense multiplier being alleviated a little bit. And you can expect a few percentage points of damage increase. And I'm going to be making a video on the effects of, going from level 95 to level 100 for, multiple sources of damage, HP scalers, attack scalers, as well as transformative reactions like Overloaded, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, etc. And from what we can see, the Bloom increase might be a lot, but we will have to wait and see when it's actually released in order to confirm that. So do smash the like and subscribe button down below to stay updated, because I will be making that video the moment that the patch goes live, because trust me, I'm gonna have a lot of these Masterless Stella Fortunas, because yeah, I've spent way too much money in this game. And one interesting thing and strategy, and the reason why I've been yapping so much about this, first of all, for you guys to understand what it is, but also because when it comes to deciding what character you should pick from the standard banner or what character you should pick from your constellation selector, this is where you might actually pick a character that's at constellation 6 in order to bring them up, in order to obtain a Masterless Stellar Fortuna. So yes, you can actually target this. And for example, if you have a constellation 5 Qiqi or something, you can actually use both your standard banner selector as well as your constellation selector in order to get 1 Masterless Stellar Fortuna. And that brings me to the 2 general points of advice that I have for when it comes to using both these tickets. First off, of course, when it comes to the Masterless Stella Fortuna strategy is that, you're probably going to do some pulls between now as well as when the ticket expires. And if that's the case, you can always take a wait and see approach, especially if you don't need any of these standard banner characters like immediately or something. Let's say you have a Constellation 4 Jean, you have Constellation 4 Qiqi, and well, you could just wait to see if you lose a 45-55 to either Qiqi or Jean. Then you'll bring them up to Constellation 5 unintentionally, at which point you can use your standard banner 5-star selector plus your Constellation selector, therefore bringing her up to Constellation 6 and then Constellation 7 in order to get a Masterless Stella Fortuna. So if you're not in a rush, we can just take a look at how long the standard banner 5-star character selector ticket will last, and then you can, make a decision based on that. And if you do take the wait and see approach, definitely set an alarm or something or a calendar reminder to tell you to use your standard banner 5-star character selector ticket before it expires. So yeah, just make sure that you don't let it go to waste. I don't know what the expiration date is going to be on it. It might not even have one, or it could last like a single day, or it could last like an entire patch. Who knows how long it will be. And for my second piece of more generalized advice is that, especially if you're a newer player, the most important thing is to just pick a character that you like, that you will enjoy playing. And for example, if you just like Plants vs Zombies, you can pick Qiqi, go beat up on some Dendro Slimes or some mushrooms or something to LARP your favorite game outside of Genshin Impact. So yeah, ultimately having fun is the most important thing. But if you do care about meta and impact and usefulness to your account, well, that's where, I'm here to give you some advice, because I played this game way too much and spent way too much money on it. And here's an exclusive 60 Primogems code for you all because you liked and subscribed. Just check the description for a link to it and or the code itself. And that finally brings us to talking about the standard banner characters. In my opinion, when it comes to standard banner characters, your priority, if you're kind of close to getting it, is to target Masterless Stella Fortunas to break level caps on characters where it might matter more. Again, stay tuned for that video in terms of what characters I recommend breaking the level cap for, which of course I will be doing a lot of testing for once the patch drops. So yeah, whatever standard banner characters you have, honestly, when it comes to their power level and overall impact to your account, they're not going to be the ones that are going to carry you through most of the difficult endgame content. Of course, getting them is nice for example, Imaginarium Theater, where having more characters matters than, for example, exactly how strong a specific character is. And you will notice that I'll probably be updating this live as I think a bit more about it. And before we talk about these characters, I'm not really ranking these constellations individually for that specific character, but instead I'm ranking kind of like how useful will this constellation be for your account as a whole. For example, yes, Keqing's constellations do improve her, but not to the point where, for example, getting a bunch of her constellations is really going to help you clear the endgame content, in my opinion. I mean, yes, it'll help a little bit, but let's be real, not like a huge amount. For example, a character like Keqing, her constellations just aren't going to be fantastic, and unfortunately, that's just the sad reality of it. Now, when it comes to Mona, her constellations are a little bit better, with, for example, her Constellation 1 improving the Hydro-related reactions by a little bit. And interestingly, we also have a bit of lunar damage improvement as well for Mona. So, she can kind of be a pinch Hydro character in those situations, which is pretty interesting. I actually think I've kind of overrated her Constellation 1 a bit. Thinking about it, I'm going to drop it down because I don't want to give you guys the wrong impression of going for this because it feels like a 2.5-star Constellation or whatever. No, I'd say it feels like maybe a 2-star value, all things considered. And if we take a look at her Constellation 4, this one's a little bit better because it basically gives, whatever characters are hitting the enemy 15% crit rate, which is nice. I mean, it's, not like a huge buff, but it's okay. It's okay. And Mona also had actually a nice uptick in usage, especially in comparison to the other standard banner character, thanks to Skirk's release. So if you're looking to, just do a lot more damage with Skirk for a few seconds. But moving on, we have Qiqi, where none of her constellations are recommended and her usage is absolutely abysmal. And then after that, we have Diluc. And Diluc does improve a little bit with his constellations 5 and 6, but let's be real, Pyro main DPS character, that role is super saturated, and I just don't really recommend targeting his constellations. Of course, when it comes to getting Constellation 6 for these characters, as well as Constellation 7 and beyond to go for the Masterless Stella Fortuna, then yes, these constellations are more valuable in that sense. Then we have Jean, where Jean's best constellation is definitely her Constellation 4, and you can definitely feel the impact on this on characters like Xiao, as well as, for example, Wanderer DPS characters, and who knows, maybe Varka too, but we're gonna have to wait and see if Varka is actually an Animo main DPS, at which point, we could bump up the rating of this constellation. But Xiao as well as Wanderer, arguably their best teammate isn't even Constellation 4 Jean in today's meta, which is kind of crazy to say, but it is still a pretty solid constellation, all things considered. And another role that Jean has, which is pretty nice, is that she is a good budget healer for Furina. So if you have Furina and you don't really have a good full party healer, well, Jean is your girl, and she can definitely help out a lot with that. And then we have Tighnari, who overall is, in my opinion, the best standard banner DPS. And Tighnari should also get a nice little bump thanks to Laoma's release if she's a character you want to pull for. But honestly, you do not need Tighnari for Laoma. If anything, Laoma is just someone, if you are a Tighnari main, Laoma can help Tighnari, but not really the other way around, if that makes sense. Tighnari doesn't really help Laoma unless you need to shoot something out of the sky. So that being said, Tighnari's Constellation 6 does make him a pretty solid character, all things considered, and it also makes him a more fun character to play because you can just toss it, and now you can spam 3 fully charged charge shots really quickly. Okay, the muscle memory is completely lost. It has been probably over a year since I've used them, so let's try it again really quick. You can just do this. You'll notice that he can fire 3 of his fully charged charge shots really quickly with his Constellation 6. And as for Dehya, she definitely gains, substantially more damage with her constellations, but even with those constellations, Dehya is not a character that you will probably use as your main Pyro DPS character. She just feels absolutely terrible to play. Her burst is wonky. You cannot jump or whatever. It just gets canceled so easily. There's a lot of issues with Dehya. However, at Constellation 0, as a character, if Dehya is a character that you don't have, then you need a consistent off-field Pyro applier. Now we do have Pyro Traveler as well coming for her job, and a lot of you guys had Mavwikas. That's all you need is just a bit of Pyro with, for example, Kanish or Molani. Then yeah, Dehya is a reasonable character choice for that. But we also have Xiangling. This role is very saturated. Dehya is not a character I recommend, but there you go. That's what Dehya can do. And let me actually scroll down to take a look at the Abyss usage rates for these characters. As you can see in the toilet for all of them, from Jean to Mizuki, at least for the recent Abysses. So not very fortunate in terms of their meta performance in the Abyss 12. Now up next we have Mizuki, and Mizuki is one of the most recently released characters, and she does have some pretty decent constellations. And one more thing about Mizuki is that if you do need an overworld exploration character, she is pretty good at that, being able to just float around as well as to provide your team healing. She can only move kind of horizontally through the air, but it is definitely nice to have, especially if you don't have any other flyers on your account. Then Mizuki is a pretty nice quality of life when it comes to exploration. And her Constellation 2 is actually pretty solid. Even with Constellation 2, Mizuki is probably not going to be your go-to character for, taser related needs, although she can be, of course. She can be, but yeah, it's still going to be a bit rough. Alright, we've made it to the featured character constellation, starting off with Klee. Now again, this is account value for these constellations, not necessarily how good these constellations are for the individual characters, so to keep that in mind. I'm going to try to keep this quick, because we've got so many characters, so many constellations to get through. So, Klee's Constellation 1, not worth getting. Constellation 2, though, is pretty decent because it provides 23% defense shred, which is another multiplier that's typically untouched by most characters' kits. For example, many whales still use her to speedrun certain things, like the Lava Dragon statue was one recently, and just every once in a while Klee will just pop up because of her pyro application, plus the fact you can slap on Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, along with the Tenacity of the Millilith or the Instructor set, in order for her to provide all her buffs very quickly and very efficiently. But that's the thing, is that this is mainly for whale players. Now, let's talk about Childe's meme of a constellation. His constellation's not recommended. His Constellation 6 actually makes his Constellation 1 obsolete, which is pretty hilarious in my opinion. Then we have Albedo, whose constellations are also honestly a scam. And yeah, hopefully, maybe we'll see these characters like Klee, Childe, Albedo get a bit of a buff, because Lord knows they need it going into Nod Cry. And it looks like they might actually be featured a bit in the story too, so hopefully they will buff these characters. Albedo's Constellations, I do not recommend any of them, so we can just move on from there. And yeah, I wasted a lot of money on this. Then we have Ganyu, whose Constellation 1 is okay, and her Constellation 4 is decent as well, you know, adding some bonus damage to the enemy, although it is a ramping up buff, which does kind of suck. And finally, her Constellation 6 is her big one, operating very similarly to Tighnari's, where it allows her to shoot an instant charged shot after she uses her elemental skill, but she can only do that twice in a row because she only has 2 charges to her elemental skill. But yeah, it is very unlikely that you have Constellation 5 Ganyu and you've been waiting to use this to get her Constellation 6, because yeah, if you're a whale, that means you probably whaled for Constellation 6. But if you are one of those people, let me know down below. I'm really curious to see if there are any people like that have these characters at Constellation 5 and are going to use this to get their Constellation 6 outside of the standard banner characters, of course. And speaking of which, if you actually do have some of these featured characters at Constellation 6, you can just get their Constellation 7 to get the Masterless Stella Fortuna, so do keep that in mind and don't forget that that is an option that you have. Up next, we have Xiao's Constellation. Xiao's Constellation 1 gives him another charge on his elemental skill. And kind of a fun fact about Xiao, some whales do actually use him as a battery because he can skill 3 times, kill the enemy with a 3rd skill, generate 2 or 3 Favonius particles as well, along with all the animal particles floating in midair in the top half of Biz 12. That way in the second half, the characters can grab it in order to grab a bunch of energy right out of the gate, in order to, you know, bypass some energy issue mechanics for continuous Biz 12 speed runs. I don't know why I'm yapping about this, total waste of time, but even for non-whaled, non-speed runners, his Constellation 1 is useful because it does a bit more damage, generates some animal particles, which of course alleviates his energy recharge requirements, which means that you can instead allocate those energy recharge stats into other stats, therefore improving his damage output overall. Xiao's Constellation 6, honestly, I'm definitely overrating this, so I'm going to bump this down to 2.5 stars. And basically, if he hit 2 enemies, he's able to dash between them with 3 elemental skill usages after hitting 2 enemies with his plunge attack. Very situational, which is a bit of an issue because we keep seeing more and more boss fights in Genshin Impact, and you can't even use his Constellation 6 against most bosses, so yeah, definitely a big issue. But when it is up and online, it is a pretty decent Constellation 6 when it is available. Then we have Hu Tao's infamous Constellation 1, which if you are using Hu Tao's main DPS without her Constellation 1, I do actually recommend getting her Constellation 1 in order to, you know, of course, be able to have much more stamina efficiency and to dash cancel 2 out of every 3 charge attacks. Basically, you will go from doing this every time with her jump cancels to instead doing this into you know, jump cancel every 3 with 2 dash cancels in between because of the stamina efficiency that her Constellation 1 provides. Hu Tao's Constellation 6 is also worth considering if you have a Constellation 5 Hu Tao for some reason, because it, you know, gives her a cheat death as well as 100% crit rate, meaning that you can, you know, build less crit rate on her in order to go for some bigger individual hits. Thanks to her Constellation 6. Of course, it does have a 60-second cooldown, so do keep that in mind. Then, unfortunately, tragically, we have Eula, whose usage rates have been absolutely atrocious. I mean, look at this. This is just some very, very unfortunate usage rates. And this is largely because physical has just been completely neglected as a damage type. I think the last thing that helped physical was Mika's release. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, and Mika is not even that good of a character. So unfortunately, Eula's been completely neglected. Perhaps we'll see a bit more of physical renaissance at some point, but until then, I cannot really recommend Eula's Constellations. Then we have Ayaka, who, let's be completely honest, her Constellation 1 is just not useful at all. I do not recommend getting it at all. However, her Constellation 2, if you do have Constellation 1 Ayaka, is worth getting because it provides 2 little additional bursts that shoot off to the side. Needless to say, making her burst do roughly 40% more damage against a target, where the 2 little bursts will stick to the enemy, and it applies an ungodly amount of cryo, allowing you to, you know, either instantly deal with the secret scam automaton shield thing, or it will allow you to, for example, melt a bunch of attacks with forward melters, like even Hu Tao can do a couple charge attacks with her burst on an Ayaka Constellation 2 burst, which is pretty neat. And Constellation 4 is nice because it provides the defense shred. And finally, Constellation 6 is also pretty solid because, you know, it gives her a little mini nuke. But I will give you this warning. In my opinion, it is not worth pulling Constellation 1 Ayaka in order to get her Constellation 2. But, you know, I don't really think they're going to rerun her outside of like Chronicled Wish or something, so probably not really an issue that you're going to run into. Then we have Yoimiya, who unfortunately as a Pyro main DPS character is just not that desirable of a Pyro main DPS character. There are so many better Pyro main DPS characters nowadays, like with Arlecchino, with Mavuika, and overall I would say Hu Tao as well, and even Gaming gives her a run for her money, and Plunge Diluc, so Yoimiya is just not in the best spot right now. Her constellations barely do anything, so yeah, I don't know what they were thinking. Now, the next character you can select a constellation for is Kokomi, and I might be overrating her constellation 1 a little bit, but this is mainly for Nilou Bloom teams, where the extra fish that she fires also applies Hydro, making her generate more blooms on a Nilou Bloom team, which of course increases the damage that your Nilou Bloom team does. So yeah, not much else more to say about Kokomi's Constellation 1 besides that, and her other constellations I do not recommend. Then we have Arataka Itto, who I'm going to be completely honest, unless you go for his Constellation 6, I don't really recommend his earlier constellations. But at Constellation 6, I think Arataka Itto is a pretty solid DPS character, but you're going to have much better options than Arataka Itto, even from a Geo DPS perspective, like Navia, and Navia with some constellations, or even Chiori with constellations, in comparison to Arataka Itto. So this will probably apply to a grand total of, I don't know, 2 people who have his Constellation 5 and plan to get his Constellation 6. Up next we have Shenhe, whose Constellation 1 gives her 2 charges of her elemental skill. This does multiple things, including allowing her to stack both of her passives bonuses, like, you know, the little bit of bonus damage to, I believe, burst damage, as well as to basic attack damage. You can now stack both of them. Also, she can generate more cryo particles with this and also provide more quills. Keep in mind that the additional quills provided do not benefit Skirk, because Skirk needs to stay on field, so therefore she cannot do a quick swap to Shenhe in order to, you know, take advantage of the additional quills generated by 2 elemental skills, because those do not add. Instead, they, you know, just take whichever one that you used recently, I believe. And also, Ayaka, for example, is the cryo DPS character, as well as Ganyu, who can take advantage of the additional quills provided by Shenhe's Constellation 1. Shenhe's Constellation 6 is also pretty decent, making her in some situations the best in slot character for Skirk teams even, but you know, we're talking whale territory levels. And yeah, Constellation 6 also makes Ayaka's Constellation 6 a much more potent nuke as well. Then we have Ayato's constellations, which I don't even want to talk about until his Constellation 6, his Boba Slash, which front loads some damage, making him like an okay, like he deals non-negligible damage at that point, I would say, but not a character I recommend investing your, you know, resources into. And I accidentally skipped Yae Miko. She certainly wouldn't be happy about that. She can work reasonably well in Lunar Charge team in lieu of Fischl. And her Constellation 1, of course, improves her energy management, which means that she can allocate more stats into attack percent, elemental mastery, crit rate, crit damage to improve her you know, compatibility with various lunar charged situations. And her Constellation 2 is the big one. And next we have Cyno. Unfortunately for Cyno, I just do not recommend him as a character, but his Constellation 1 and 2 provide non-negligible boosts to him, which is nice. So yeah, you can consider that if you really like Cyno and you just want to make him a little bit stronger, but overall not really something I strongly recommend. And then we have Nilou, who Nilou's definitely gonna have a renaissance thanks to Llama's release. Her Constellation 1 is okay because it basically gives her 100% uptime on her Tranquility Aura after you use her elemental skill 3 times, or, you know, have the third part of her. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to get into all the if, ands, and buts. But yeah, this will allow her to apply Hydro a few more times, which means more blooms for her team, which means a bit more damage outputted from Nilou. And her Constellation 2 is the big one, which provides 35% Dendro and Hydro resistance shred, which means that everyone in her team is going to be doing more damage. And this is one of the better Constellation 2s on this list, but do keep in mind that this might sound a little bit controversial, but if you know you are limited on the number of pulls you are planning for, I don't recommend pulling for Nilou's Constellation 1, or frankly even for Nilou, on the Chronicled Wish banner, which will be running in tandem. If you pull for her Constellation 1, this is equivalent to, for example, pulling for a Constellation 0 Nefer. And I'm willing to bet money that a Constellation 0 Nefer is going to blow this stuff out of the park, because with the amount of power creep that we're seeing these days, pulling for these older characters just isn't worth it. But if you do have Nilou and you don't really have anything else to spend this on, Nilou's Constellations 1, and if you already have Nilou's Constellation 1, then by proxy Nilou's Constellation 2 are worth getting, in my opinion, through the Masterless Stella Fortuna. Then we have Wanderer, whose Constellation 1 is indeed a nice improvement to his damage output, as well as his Constellation 2 significantly improving his elemental burst damage, making him, you know, a bit of a better character, all things considered. Wander, though, just not in the best spot in today's meta, but he can be used with some newer mechanics, which is pretty cool. Like, he can be absolutely used with Lunar Charge, which is nice, as well as, you know, just Wander is a pretty flexible DPS character, all things considered, so yeah. Then we have Baizhu's Constellation 1, and I have a bit of a bias towards Baizhu. I do think he's a pretty good character. Baizhu, of course, great compatibility with Furina. Baizhu's Constellation 1 is nice because, you know, having an extra charge means he heals more, generates more particles, but his Constellation 2 is also pretty solid because now he will basically apply his thing while completely off field. You don't even have to swap him on, and even to this day, even though he's not like the biggest damage boost for Neuvillette, I still do occasionally use him with Neuvillette when I do use Neuvillette because his Constellation 2 is just such a great quality of life, reducing the amount of field time that he needs in order to provide it for a character like Neuvillette. And yeah, so pretty decent Constellations 1 and 2 for Baizhu. Now, the last bit of advice when it comes to the Masterless Stella Fortuna, if honestly your account doesn't need any of these constellations for these featured characters, you can always just spend one of these constellations on a standard banner character, and I would recommend targeting your highest constellations standard banner characters in order to push them closer to Constellation 6. So that way you are closer to obtaining the Masterless Stella Fortunas when you do lose your 50/50s, and of course you can always spend them on your Constellation 6 standard banner characters in order to grab those Masterless Stella Fortunas. So don't forget, when it comes to selecting these constellations, you can always just pick Constellation 7 on standard banner characters in order to gain the level cap breakpoint item things. So there you go, that's my full list and advice for the Constellation as well as Standard Banner Character Selector. Hopefully it shined a little bit of insight for you guys and maybe might help you guys make your decisions as you get through these and unlock those constellations and whatnot. And I'm certain I've missed a lot of details and stuff, and if you guys disagree or have some additional advice for other players, definitely leave that down in the comments below. And who knows, maybe Genshin Impact will buff various of these characters and this advice will change as time moves on with, new release characters in the future. Like, hey, maybe Klee and Alice will somehow work together really well, which, I would love to see a combo like that work out. But we're going to have to wait and see what Genshin Impact throws at us, and hopefully you guys found this guide helpful in some way or another. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.